Good morning and welcome to the electronic seminar series on social policy. Today we have Dr. Robert van Niekerk, who is a research fellow at the Department of Social Policy and Social Work. He is also the Deputy Director of the Center for the Analysis of South African Social Policy. His area of research and interest is the institutional history and understanding of health and welfare reform in South Africa. He's also interested in social policy in post-apartheid South Africa, particularly anti-poverty policies and factors which account for success and failure in social policy implementation. His doctorate is on social policy and citizenship and the development of inclusive, de-racialized social policies in the period between 1939 and 1961 and the period between 1989 and 1998. Robert will be returning to South Africa, where he will be taking up an associate professorship at Rhodes University. Today, he will be doing a presentation on the emergence and development of inclusive social policy and social rights of citizenship in South Africa between 1939 and 1961. Over to you, Robert.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Bakam, and thanks for that lovely introduction. My talk today, as Bakam has indicated, is on the emergence and development of inclusive social policy in South Africa between 1939 and 1961. And what I'd like to do in this introductory talk is to really just introduce some of the key issues that emerged for the development of inclusive social policy in South Africa in the period of the 1940s in particular. I want to try and give a flavor of the time and why this time was very important for the development of social policies that aim to address some of the problems of segregation of the period. I also want to particularly look at the role of black political thinkers in the period, the thinking on social policy and the thinking on social rights of citizenship, as this has largely been a neglected area in the literature. So it also wants to reclaim some of the rich tradition of thinking on social policy in the period of the 1940s. And the aim of the historical aspects of the talk is really to give a sense of the continuity in thinking between this period and the much later period that comes. Of course, that's the transition period in South Africa, the 1940, the post-94 period. That's not a period I'll be looking at in this particular talk, but what I'd want to do is suggest that, in fact, looking back at this history in the period of the 1940s and also looking at what happened to social policy in the apartheid era of the 1950s provides us with some basis to explore social policy from a historical perspective and try and reclaim some of the rich tradition of thinking and legacies of thinking on social policy to inform current attempts to reform South African social policy in more inclusive directions. Now, a talk's already been provided by Dr. Hartley Dean on social rights of citizenship, so I don't want to cover that material again, but what I'd like to do is just to highlight some of the key conceptual concerns of citizenship from a social rights perspective, and highlight it in relation to the talk and provide some form of a conceptual prism to understand the emergence of inclusive social policy in South Africa in the period of the 40s and the 50s. And I want to start by referring to T.H. Marshall. Of course, he wrote a classic essay on social citizenship called Citizenship and Social Class in 1950. And Marshall essentially argued that social rights evolved progressively from contested civil and political rights. So it was with the gradual emergence at each stage of development of rights, from civil rights, which included rights to conclude contracts, for example, to political rights, which is, of course, rights related to the ability to vote and to participate in political events and political and parliamentary procedures, to social rights, which involve a state-guaranteed right to a minimum basket of goods such as health, welfare, and income maintenance. And Marshall essentially argued that these rights emerged historically in stages, and that, in fact, political rights were necessary for the achievement of social rights, and that social rights essentially involve the social consensus based on a minimum provision of welfare, which is education, health, and income for citizens as an entitlement of citizenship. So it's not a form of charity, it's an entitlement of citizenship. And the institutional form that this took, this social consensus based on a minimum provision of welfare, is the welfare state. So that is Marshall's view of citizenship and its relationship to social class. However, there are responses to this work of Marshall from the neoliberal perspective associated with writers such as Friedman and Hayek. They would argue that in fact it's not the role of the state to involve themselves in meeting the social needs of citizens, that the state should restrict itself to defending what they describe as negative freedoms, which is policing, defense, and individual civil liberties. They would also argue that the market should be the sole arbiter of social needs, so there shouldn't be state intervention in meeting social need. And they also argue that that's because state provision is seen as coercive of individuals. And the question that sort of emerges for our South African case is how would one relate this notion of negative freedoms to South Africa during the apartheid and segregation era? Are the negative freedoms, for example, to policing, defense, and particularly individual civil liberties equally protected in the era of segregation and apartheid? There's also, of course, responses to Marshall from a left social democratic perspective. And in this left social democratic perspective, there's a concern that social rights are aimed at mediating the inequalities of class-stratified societies by providing citizens with livelihood outside the market. And particularly writers such as Richard Titmuss, one of the key social theorists of social policy, would argue that in fact social rights not only mediates social inequalities, but creates a basis for dealing with the inequalities caused by capitalist industrialization, which creates this welfare to some citizens and benefits some citizens more than it benefits others. So you would argue that social rights are absolutely essential for meeting social needs of society and creating a culture of social solidarity in the society on which can be based the further development of social rights of citizenship. Okay, but there's also a socialist critique, and associated particularly with Klaus Oaf, which argues that social rights are essential for the reproduction of labor power and maintaining the conditions of capital accumulation. So they, in the socialist perspective, there would be a much more critical view of what the function of social rights are, and is it merely to placate the needs of the working class as they become part of the process of capitalist industrialization. And also that social rights creates a dichotomy between the economic sphere and social sphere, falsifying in this way social relations are based on exploitation. So these are some theories of social rights of citizenship, and I'm hoping in the course of the talk not to demonstrate the applicability of the theory, but actually to use it as a conceptual and theoretical prism to look at the emergence of social policies in the South African context. So the warriors of the 1940s and social policy. One of the first things one needs to say is that the war years of the 1940s created the conditions for new forms of social policy to emerge. And one has to ask the question, what is specific and particular about the war years of the 1940s that allows these new inclusive forms of social policies to emerge, not just in countries like Britain, but also in South Africa? Okay, so the first thing to say was that the 1940s was a period of global political and social change induced by the Second World War and the struggle against Nazism and fascism. And the period preceding the war years was characterized by mass urban poverty associated with industrialization and the need to expand housing, health and welfare provision for the working classes who came to the industrial areas in search of work, but for which the state wasn't really geared to provide adequate forms of housing and health and welfare provision because of the patchwork of systems that were available and the piecemeal nature in which provision was provided. The declaration in Britain against Nazi Germany of war in 1939 completely changed the way social relations were structured between the state and its citizens. Total war involved citizens' efforts in, for example, producing ammunitions as important as the armies fighting in the foreign countries. This was distinctive from the First World War, where it was the armies fighting in the wars away in foreign lands that were the primary force for overcoming the enemy action. So first point was total war involved citizens being engaged in meeting the social needs within society in cooperation with the state. So massive amount of need for planning and also a massive amount of need for dealing with social problems within the society, because if citizens were going to be effective in prosecuting the war, they themselves needed to be healthy, they needed to be well fed, they needed to be well organized. So the state took on a much stronger role in meeting social needs, much more direct planned role in meeting social needs. The other part of it, of course, is that citizens in the context of a total war were equally affected by war. So, for example, in Britain you had the rationing of food and the evacuation of citizens consequent of the bombings, which contributed to social levelling in the society. And how did it contribute to social levelling in the society? Well, for the first time you had middle class and working class people both being bombed by Nazi Germany, having to occupy, for example, the underground train stations, which are called the tubes. And for the first time, working class and middle class people saw their social lives from a vantage point other than the one that they had found themselves in the pre-1939 period, which of course was for the working class associated with this urban poverty. So with the citizens equally affected by war, you found gradually emerging a culture of social solidarity, that people felt that not only were they prosecuting a war against an external enemy, and of course Germany then represented racial domination and territorial aggrandizement in its most hostile form, but they also talked to how they could reconstruct their own societies so that social needs of citizens could be met in a way that it hadn't been met in the pre-war era. So this contributed to the emergence of new ideas, cultures of social solidarity, which started to permeate the society and created the conditions for more progressive forms of social policies to emerge, more inclusive forms of social policies to emerge in the era. And this, of course, is the context of the war. Britain had entered the war in 1939 against Nazi Germany. But of course, South Africa had also been implicated by the war period. And one has to say, in relation to the idea of cultures of social solidarity and the notion of a post-war that would not be characterized by mass urban poverty and problems of housing, health and welfare that had been experienced by working people in the war years, that the post-war vision was one of talking to what the new society would look like at a global scale. And that post-war vision was captured in the Atlantic Charter, which was an agreement between Churchill, the leader of the British government during the war, and Roosevelt, the American leader. They both agreed on the need for post-war democratization and improvement of welfare societies living under Nazi and fascist occupation. So essentially they were saying the people's contract would be one where that if they were fighting Nazi domination, which represented territorial aggrandizement and racial domination, then the new kind of society had to be about something else. And that new kind of society at a global level would be, and the two key parts are, to respect the rights of all people to choose the form of government under which they would live, and the sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who had been forcibly deprived of them. Okay, and secondly, to secure for all improved labor standards, economic advancement and social security. So that was the new kind of society that would be a product of the war if the Allies, and Allies would include South Africa, if they'd won the war. Okay, and this was a very crucial recognition for the first time that democratization needed to obtain across the world. And of course, not only democratization in societies under Nazi and fascist occupation, but also in the colonial territories. And this is what spurred on thinking within South Africa in the Black Liberation Movement about the possibilities of a new kind of society for South Africa based on the Atlantic Charter. Also, the Atlantic Charter's provision of improved labor standards, economic advancement and social security was the first time at a global level that there was a call for improving the social conditions of people across the world. So this is a very significant statement. So let's look at what the Atlantic Charter provision meant for South Africa. Firstly, there was a convergence with the Allied cause in the anti-fascist struggle as a result of a common acknowledgement of the 1941 Atlantic Charter. So both the white ruling party, which was the Smuts' United Party of the segregation era, and the black opposition movement led by essentially the African National Congress and its leader Abel Kuma of the time, both agreed and converged on the need to support the Allied cause against Nazi Germany. Okay, and the need for and the support was based on the idea that post-war society should be based on unqualified citizenship, social security and democratic norms. So both Smuts' United Party and Abel Kuma and the ANC agreed with this, but they came to this position from very different standpoints. Jan Smuts was a general and leader of the United Party who came to power in 1939 on a very slim majority over the Afrikaner parties, such as the National Party. And the Afrikaner parties were opposed to the war with Germany. He was a Boer War general. He was a statesman who was well respected in the Western world. But Smuts was also a proponent of trusteeship. And trusteeship was not about the extension of social citizenship in its Marshallian sense to blacks. It was the amelioration of the effects of social segregation, where whites would take on the roles of guardians to blacks who were coming from the rural areas to the urban areas. It was essentially a form of racial paternalism. So Smuts had a very restricted notion of citizenship and its extension to South African blacks in the context of the Atlantic Charter provisions. What he sought was a more sort of paternalistic view and a guardianship role of whites over blacks, and not a full extension of social citizenship in a Marshallian sense. However, his approach that was diametrically different to the one proposed by Dr. Abed Kuma. And Dr. Abed Kuma was a very influential figure in the ANC in the 1940s. He is someone who has unfortunately been neglected in the historiography of South Africa, but I would argue has a role and performed a role that was as crucial as figures, for example, such as Nelson Mandela. Firstly, Abed Kuma was the first unambiguous proponent of universal political citizenship as a core political objective of the ANC. Okay, this has often been argued to have emerged only with the ANC Youth League in the 1950s, but in fact it's with Abed Kuma in the 1940s that you first had the emergence of the idea of universal political citizenship as a core demand of the ANC, moving the ANC from a petition-based organization cohered around political elites within the black political intelligentsia. So Zuma's other contributions to political life in South Africa, black political life in South Africa, was that he democratized the ANC into a national mass movement through painstaking grassroots political work throughout the provinces. He inaugurated a modern constitution and an accountable membership within the ANC. And also in the context of the constitution, under Abed Kuma's leadership, women were allowed equal organizational status in the organization. So Abed Kuma plays a very significant role in the political life of black South Africans, because for the first time he sees the importance of creating a mass-based movement that was democratically accountable and cohered around the notion of universal political citizenship being the core demand of black aspirations. And so this, for me, is some of the reasons why Abed Kuma is a very significant historical figure in South Africa. Okay. But if we were to look then at this context of the 1940s, the possibilities of the Atlantic Charter provisions as it's interpreted within the ruling white intelligentsia and Smuts' United Party, we saw that social legislation was able to emerge because the United Party was also in 1939 quite vulnerable and politically dependent on black political and economic support for the war effort. And this essentially opened the space for reformist proposals on social policy. And some of the key proposals that emerged from social reformers within the United Party were, for example, the Committee on Urban and Social Conditions of Africans of 1942. And this committee, which was chaired by Smith, who was a liberal reformer and an MP within the United Party, proposed the expansion of African housing in urban areas by compelling white local authorities to cross-subsidize housing for Africans. Okay, it also recommended extensive improvements in health and welfare provision for African in urban areas, and castigated the failure of white local authorities to meet the social needs of urbanizing Africans. Okay, and most interestingly and radically for the time, the Smith Committee also called for the eradication of the pass laws, which control the movement of blacks from the rural areas into the urban areas, because it was proving unworkable. So the Smith Committee actually recommended far-reaching proposals on the reform on the urban conditions of Africans in 1942. Another very important committee that emerged in the war years under the United Party was the Gluckman Committee on National Health Service. And the proposals of the National Health Committee, or the Gluckman Commission, was perhaps the most radical set of proposals that were ever to emerge on healthcare reform in South Africa, both in the pre- and post-apartheid era, arguably. And Gluckman's commission argued for an integrated national health service for all citizens, which would be controlled by the state. So it would be a state-led service, which of course is equivalent to the National Health Service in Britain. And that would also be non-racial and free at the point of delivery. Of course, this is again commensurate with the proposals that were emerging in Britain at the same time for National Health Service, which would be free at the point of delivery. Gluckman also argued radically and controversially for the time that medical doctors would become employees of the state. This would be done through consensus, but over time, essentially, all medical doctors would become employees of the state. So what he saw was a fully integrated national health service that would be free at the point of delivery, would be based on public healthcare centres as the core provider in local communities. And he also, and controversially, proposed that the control of state medical hospitals should be taken over by the state. So the big tertiary medical hospitals should lose their financial autonomy and their management autonomy, and this should be taken over by the state. And he said that this, and Gluckman that is, proposed that this would be an essential precondition for creating a national health service. So that was another important in the area of health and very important set of proposals. There was also in 1944, again under the United Party, the Social Security Committee, which proposed the racially differentiated national extension of social security arrangements. So what it essentially was arguing for was the extension of social security arrangements to citizens who had previously not been part of the social security system. It argued for old age blindness and invalidity pensions, which were to be applied to all beneficiaries of this new comprehensive social security scheme. It also argued for sick pay to be introduced and for maternity grants for women in lieu of wages lost. So also a range of proposals that essentially was talking about the extension of social security to larger sectors of the society. Of course, the proposals were racially differentiated, but what was interesting about this committee was that it was considering how income security or income maintenance could be extended to both black and whites within the context of the segmented South African labour market, which for the time again was also quite far-reaching effort at trying to transform South African social policy in more egalitarian directions. Okay, but in the end, it was only social security grants again which were racially differentiated, which means that whites, blacks, Indians, and colours got different payment amounts. Was extended to Africans in 1944. Okay, but there were other initiatives as well. It's led essentially by the key reformer within the United Party, which was Jan Hofmeyr. And Jan Hofmeyr, as Minister of Education at the time, extended African education to become part of the central government budget. Okay, now the importance of this needs to be seen in the light of what preceded it. And what preceded education, African education, was that it was a separate racialized budgeting based on African tax-paying capability. And of course, because African tax-paying capability was quite weak because of the racialized labor market, only a minor amount of funds compared to the amount of funds that went into white education was actually going through to African education. So this was a very radical change in principle to the way that funding was allocated to African education. It also established the principle that African education was a responsibility of the state, and implicitly meant that white taxpayers had to take some responsibility for the provision of African education. So although the funding, of course, was radically differentially funded, the principle established allowed the possibility at a later stage to equalize funding, because education for Africans had become part of the essential state responsibility. This also included the school feeding scheme and the milk scheme, which was also extended to African school-going children from the central budget. So I can see some of the social legislation that had emerged from the part of social reformers within the United Party were talking to a far more reaching and more egalitarian search for social policy proposals. But, and this is an essential but, those policies were circumscribed by the fact that blacks didn't have political citizenship in South Africa at the time. And the question that emerged was, to what extent could these social rights of citizenship be effected without political rights or the universal franchise being extended to all citizens in the society? And this is a question that the social legislation that emerged did not confront. What it did confront was the extension of social rights within the context of limited citizenship. But the question of whether this could actually be achieved in the context of lack of universal franchise was unexplored. The idea, though, of universal franchise being the underpinning of social rights of citizenship was to be most clearly articulated in a document called African Claims of 1943. And African Claims was a document that was assembled by the leading political thinkers within the ANC under the leadership of Abby Kuma to talk to the meaning of the Atlantic Charter's provisions for democratization and extension of social security at a global level to the South African conditions, and particularly the conditions of disenfranchised blacks. So essentially what it presented was an Africanization of the Atlantic Charter. And this is a very significant document, equally significant, I think, in the political historiography of South Africa to a later document, the Freedom Charter of 1959. Okay, because in this document, African Claims of 1943, you had the first unambiguously stated demand for universal franchise for all citizens of South Africa and equal entitlements to political, civil and social rights. If you want to locate a place where this becomes a organized public political demand on the part of the National Liberation Movement, then you need to look to African Claims, the demand, of course, for universal franchise. Okay, and on the basis that universal franchise would be extended to all citizens after the war, the Second World War, the ANC, under the leadership of Kuma, supported the struggle to overthrow Nazism and fascism. Okay, and I quote Abby Kuma in his preface to the African Claims. He says, "I call upon men and women of all ranks and classes to close ranks, take their place in this mass liberation movement and struggle expressed in this Bill of Citizenship Rights until freedom, rights and justice are won for all races and color." Now, I think for me what's very significant in what Kuma says here is that he uses the language of all ranks and classes. He used the languages of all race and color. And this is significant because of the inclusivity it suggested that Kuma was, and the ANC at the time, and in a sense, the current of social democracy represented by African Claims and thinkers such as Abby Kuma and Z.K. Matthews and others, was that the struggle to create universal citizenship was an inclusive struggle that included all groups, whatever their social position, who supported the ideal of a universal franchise. And I think that's a crucial underpinning of the African Claims, its inclusivity in talking to the creation of a new kind of society based on political citizenship. Okay. Now, one of the key components of African Claims was a Bill of Rights, okay, which was underpinned again by what I would describe as a social democratic rights-based ethos. If we recall in the earlier introduction about the underpinnings of social democratic rights was that the state provided the citizens a minimum basket of goods, which was an entitlement of citizenship and not a provision sourced through, for example, charity. So the Bill of Rights in African Claims of 1943 talked to the establishment of free medical and health services, again, for all sections of the population, okay, the right of every child to free and compulsory education, and the equality of treatment with other sections of the population in state social services, the inclusion, for example, on an equal basis in any scheme of social security. So the Bill of Rights really talked to the emergence of the organization of society where a minimum basket of goods would be provided by the state as an entitlement and which would be provided free of charge, and in a sense could be arguably be seen as the embryo of a notion of a redistributive welfare state in a South African context. If one was to look at the culmination of these proposals and the actual implementation, and if they were to be implemented, one could arguably say that what you'd come up with was some form of a redistributive welfare state, given the state's involvement in meeting these social needs. Okay, so African Claims in its discourse was similar to a social democratic discourse which emerged in the Labour Party in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the Labour Party was still a socialist party led by Clement Attlee. It still talked to ownership of the means production on the part of the working class. And in the 1940s, a lot of the social proposals, such as the Beveridge proposals on the extension of income maintenance and the proposals for the extension of education and healthcare, was premised on direct state intervention to secure social rights to free education, health and income maintenance. So we can see the similarities in the discourse of African Claims and the discourse that traces itself back, for example, to the Labour Party of the 1940s. And the crucial part of this discourse of African Claims was that it established the primacy of inclusive social policy, and in Britain it would be the Beveridge Report, for example, on social insurance, this primacy of inclusive social policy over economic policy, that inclusive social policy would be the architect or encapsulate the vision of the new kind of society to be created, and economic policy would follow then to give effect to the social vision implicated by the social policies. And of course in South Africa and in African claims it was for very comprehensive health and education and the extension of social security legislation to all citizens. Okay, and in Britain this primacy of inclusive social policy, of economic policy, was contained in the White Paper on Employment Policy, which guaranteed full employment based on Keynesian economic principles. So you could see how the language of social democratic discourse that emerged essentially from the war years in Britain filtered down and also became hugely relevant to thinking within the black political elite in the same period of the 1940s in the South African context. Okay. But between 1943 and 1948, in 1943, Smuts was elected on a wider majority by the restricted white vote of the time. You find it from 1943 and after this election to 1948, when the National Party came to power, you find the decline, in fact, of these inclusive social policy proposals. And one need to look to reasons why there was the decline of these inclusive social policy proposals. One first needs to look, for example, to what was happening in white electoral politics. Okay, and in white electoral politics in the time, the post-war white electorate was opposed to the comprehensive extension of welfare to blacks. Okay, and the reasons were there was a shift in support from the United Party under Smuts to Afrikaner parties such as the National Party, consequent of the shortage of cheap labour following the relaxation of the pass laws. So Afrikaner parties, many of whom had interest in farming, were alienated by the relaxation of the pass laws, which allowed their workers who were working for essentially a pittance on the farms to go to the urban areas and to the mines, where they earned a relatively better wage on the comparative gorge of exploitative wage labor in South Africa of the time. Okay, so the huge political consequence for the United Party by relaxing the pass laws. There was also a right-wing shift within the Smuts and the United Party after the 1943 election, when it was clear that South Africa wasn't going to be invaded and the government no longer needed the political support of blacks. You found increasingly a reneging on that commitment to extend social rights of citizenship, not only social rights of citizenship, but political citizenship to blacks. And you also had a response on the part of the Smuts United Party to the rise of militant trade unionism, famously described in the 1946 mine workers' strike. And also socialist activism, where the Communist Party of South Africa and other socialist groups became quite active in trying to promote a different alternative socialist view of society, which would engage the exploitative underpinnings of capitalist society of the time. And this led to it caused a right-wing shift in thinking within Smuts and the United Party away from the inclusive social policies. And then there were also fiscal reasons. Smuts balked at the cost of extending comprehensive social security in the way that was envisaged in the Social Security Committee of 1944. He felt that it was, in fact, unaffordable. Also, the proposals to take control of the provincial hospitals and away from the four provinces was something that Smuts also balked at because of the political consequences of doing this, that he felt that he would lose the political support within the provinces if he was to nationalize the big medical hospitals, which were the main drainage of public health resources. So the Gluckman proposals were abandoned because of the political expediency on the part of Smuts at the time. Okay, and essentially Smuts appeased this electoral reaction and failed to implement the social policy proposals except in a racially differentiated form. So some of the proposals around extension of income security, income maintenance, unemployment benefit was extended to white workers, for example, whereas black workers were either denied access to these arrangements or were provided to them at a much more reduced scale. And what you had essentially emerging, I would argue, was a welfare state of sorts, or a racialized welfare state of sorts for whites, okay, and a diswelfare state for Africans. Okay, so we've discussed some of the reasons why there was a decline of inclusive social policy and looked at some of the causes within stemming from changes within white electoral politics. And also one needs to look at the black opposition and what was happening in the black opposition at the same time, and to try and account for the decline of these inclusive social policy agenda of between 1943 and 1948. Okay, and one of the key reasons within the black opposition for the decline in support for these inclusive social policies, as propounded through cooperation between the Smuts government and the Nkrumah's ANC, was the failure to implement African claims provisions on universal citizenship, which undermined the possibilities for this inclusive social policy. And this was tellingly represented by a quote made by Abe Nkrumah into the 1943 ANC National Conference. And I quote Nkrumah, he says, "In the political sphere, the African has no status. He is a South African national, but not a citizen. Without political power, people have no rights. We must therefore demand, work, and fight for full political rights." And the important point here, of course, was that by this period in the mid-1940s, Nkrumah was confronting the limitations of achieving social rights of citizenship and the possibilities of some consensual approach to democratization based on the implementation of the Atlantic Charter's provisions in the context of lack of political citizenship for blacks, or the lack of democracy in South African society at the time. And of course, the countervailing response to Smuts' increasing shift to the right was that there was a shift within post-war black opposition and an erosion of the constitutional methods propounded by Nkrumah in favor of direct action. And this was exemplified, for example, in the ANC Youth League of the late 1940s, led by leaders such as Anton Lambedi, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela, who were in favor of extra-constitutional mass-based opposition to the state of the time, the Smuts' United Party of the time. And they were in favor of direct action which would secure political citizenship without having to go through state-constructed institutions such as the bodies that existed at the time. So in fact, what you had was a shift in black opposition towards more militant forms of protest and a move away from more constitutional methods favored by people like Abe Nkrumah. And this also contributed to the decline in this agenda of inclusive social policy that was predicated on some form of a consensus between the United Party and the ANC under Nkrumah at the time. But to really contrast the possibilities of the proposals of the 1940s, which didn't reach fruition, one needs to see what happened to social policy with the coming into power of the National Party in 1948 and the implementation of apartheid and what I would describe as the development of an anti-welfare state. Firstly, you had intensified racial divisions in social policy with the coming to power of the of the National Party. And this was illustrated, for example, in the case of housing. Now, curiously, housing actually increased in the period of the first period of apartheid rule from 1948. And one would ask oneself, why did housing increase? Okay, housing increased, and this was site and service housing, so it was minimally provided housing, increased and was extended because it allowed the new apartheid government to distinguish between workers who were legally in the urban areas, which were then designated as white areas, and workers who were illegally in those areas under what was described as Section 10 rights. So the extension of site and services housing was meant primarily as a mechanism of control of blacks within white areas. It wasn't meant as an extension of social rights of citizenship, and it was aimed at the objective of apartheid, which was to intensify racial divisions in social policy. Okay, there was also the re-racialized budgeting of African education. Must remember, under Hofmeyr, African education became a state responsibility. Okay, this was removed when the apartheid government came to power, and the Commission on Native Education, or the Iceland Commission, from 1949 to 1951, implemented Bantu education, and Bantu education was aimed at the subordination of black education to apartheid imperatives of control and the circumscribing of black labor. Also, black education was separately administered and differentially funded. So there was a return to the position before 1939, basically a racialized recompartmentalization, organization and administration of education, with the additional objective of creating a subordinate, of the additional objective of subordinating black education to the needs of apartheid in the period. Then you also had the creation of the Bantustans, which led to further administrative and fiscal administration. And in these Bantustans, which were essentially areas which were defined as the domicile or the areas of habitation of blacks according to ethnicity, these Bantustan homelands, which were characterized by a lack of the ability to create a livelihood for blacks, was led to the health and welfare education system being ethnically fragmented and led to the racial administration of service delivery. Okay, and so what you had, I would argue, was the move from this welfare state in the segregation era to increasingly an anti-welfare state for Africans in the apartheid era, given the increasingly diminished life chances and life opportunities of blacks consequent of the implementation of apartheid in the ways that I've just described: the racial division in social policy, the re-racialized budgeting of African education, and the creation of these Bantustans, which remove citizenship entitlements into these ethnic enclaves. Okay. So in a sense, in the 1950s, you had the almost complete decline of the possibilities of inclusive social policy suggested by the 1940s period. Okay, and you had, on the part of the black opposition in the 1940s, the emergence of political citizenship as a primary demand to which all other objectives, including social rights of citizenship, needed to be subordinated to. So the ANC in the 1940s focused on political citizenship as a primary objective of its political activities. In 1955, you had the Congress of the People at Kliptown, where the Freedom Charter was unveiled. And the Freedom Charter involved a campaign on the form of state which could overcome the legacy of apartheid. It contained a series of demands framed by the primary citizenship demand that the people shall govern. Okay, so the Freedom Charter was distinguishable in this sense from the African claims in that it was more declamatory. It talked to engaging the state, a new form of state, and it implied some form of social organization to create this new state. Okay, but in addition to this primary demand for political citizenship, the Freedom Charter also contained demands for social rights, including rights related to income maintenance, state-provided free and universal education, rights to housing, and rights to free state-provided medical care. And I would again argue, as in African claims, that these rights were commensurate with a social democratic approach to meeting social rights of citizenship. And some of those demands in the Freedom Charter are of course well known. They included the right and duty of all to work, so work becomes a right and a duty. It included a national minimum wage, a call for national minimum wage, included a demand that education should be free, compulsory, universal, and equal for all children, and that all people should have the right to live where they choose and be decently housed, as well as the demand that no one should go hungry, and that free medical education and hospitalization would be provided for all. So this radical set of proposals not only reflected a social democratic ethos, but in fact, if they were to be fully implemented, would have led to, in South Africa, the establishment of a welfare state commensurate with the welfare state that had been established in Britain in the 1950s during the period of the Attlee government. So the significance of the Freedom Charter was that in its institutional form, or if it had been institutionalized, what we would have seen emerging in South Africa, in fact, was a welfare state of sorts. Okay. And also, it's important to reflect on some of the mechanisms that thinkers in the time were talking to implement the goals of the Freedom Charter. And of course, we're concerned here with the social policy proposals of the Freedom Charter. Okay, and the key thinker here that one needs to draw attention to is Albert Luthuli, who was a leader of the ANC at the time. Okay, was very influenced by the social democratic discourse that had emerged from the Labour Party, and in fact had been a proponent of the welfare state as it had emerged under the Attlee government. And Luthuli argued that the ANC continued to support free education, affordable municipal housing, and state-provided employment for the bulk of the people would also enjoy unqualified rights to unionization. And in fact, in this period in 1962, when Luthuli was talking to these social rights of citizenship, the ANC had in fact been banned for a year. The mechanisms that Luthuli argued for was that nationalization would be a necessary mechanism if the government was to see through its agenda of social reforms, and the state able to carry out effectively its uplift work, as he described it. Okay. And then I think this is very important as a historical reflection on the emergence of the social rights of citizenship and the institutional form. Luthuli advocated that the new democratic government would have as its objective the creation, and I would quote, a democratic social welfare state. This is what Luthuli argued for, a democratic social welfare state. And he went on to say, and I quote, a state as I visualize, a democratic social welfare state cannot be born in one day. He said that it will be the paramount task of the government to bring it about, to advance it without crippling industry, commerce, farming and education. So he said, this is the challenge. How do we create this democratic social welfare state in the context of the conditions which we confront in South Africa? And the conditions, of course, was then of the apartheid era. But I think the crucial thing that Luthuli alerts us, and why I think this historical review becomes important, is because it distills a legacy of thinking over 15 years about the institutional form of state that could overcome the legacy of segregation, that could overcome the legacy of apartheid. And one could see consistency in the proposals, both of African claims and the Freedom Charter, in response to the exclusionary proposals of the apartheid era and the unrealized proposals of the segregation era under Smuts. And that is that, in fact, the institutional form to overcome this legacy of exclusion was a democratic social welfare state of sorts. And this is a question that I think still begs itself in current South Africa about what institutional form of state could best realize the social needs of South African. The historical example of thinking within the Black Liberation Movement, as exemplified by Kuma and Luthuli, talk about this notion of a democratic social welfare state. The question one has to ask ourselves is this a desirable objective, this engagement by the state of meeting social needs as an entitlement of citizenship, a minimum basket of goods, and implementing the necessary economic mechanisms to give effect to this? Is this an ideal that we can still look to in current South Africa? Of course, the ANC was banned between 1960 and 1990, and the struggle to achieve a democratic state based on universal franchise took priority over further discussions relating to inclusive social policy for apartheid welfare state. But I think we're now in a new era where the possibilities of a transformative social policy that can meet social need and an institutional form of that state, some have argued that perhaps it needs to take the form of a developmental state. But what perhaps is still left unresolved is this historical agenda and its emergence in the 1940s and its continuation in the 1950s of the idea of social rights of citizenship in a South African context being codified in a democratic social welfare state. And that is the question mark that I'd like to leave you with here about how do we reclaim this rich legacy, this rich historical legacy, so that we can see through the unfinished agenda of the 1940s and 50s, the unfinished agenda of Kuma, and the unfinished agenda of Luthuli and the democratic liberal reformers of the period, the social democrats of the period, to create an inclusive social policy which fully met all the social needs of South African citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very interesting. To what extent do you think political citizenship took precedence, necessarily so, over social citizenship in the country, and what impact do you think that has had in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, you saw in the period essentially between 1960 with the unbanning of the ANC to 1990, that a lot of the impetus and efforts and energy of the ANC as a political liberation movement was on the achievement of the franchise demand. Of course, it stems from the African claims, the Freedom Charter, and so forth. So yes, in fact, what you found in that period was subordination of social rights agenda to this imperative for political citizenship. And I think it was inescapable also because you had this incredible repressive regime that was being fought against. But I think part of the policy possibilities of the 1940s, particularly the rich set of policy possibilities around, for example, African claims, and then the Freedom Charter of 1955, perhaps needs to be reclaimed, it needs to be resurrected, and the relevance of the impetus, and by that I mean the kind of agenda setting about a new kind of society which encodes a new kind of social vision and on which social policies are predicated, can be meaningfully reflected upon, can be meaningfully recaptured. Because what I think we're falling into is a trap of having a set of policies across social sectors but which are not integrated. And I think what African Claims did for me was it integrated the social vision about what kind of new society we wanted to have, and what would be the role of the state in achieving that. And maybe returning to that agenda would reverse this problem of political citizenship being given prominence over this other agenda of social rights of citizenship.
And what relevance do you think the social democratic approach could have in South Africa?
I think, of course, in my talk, I'm trying to illustrate the fact that in the ANC, in the period, exemplified in thinkers like Abid Kuma, and also people like Z.K. Matthews, that in fact there was a very strong social democratic current within the ANC, which talked about state role in meeting social needs, which talked about forms of social rights, which were an entitlement of citizenship, this minimum basket of goods, in the Marshallian sense, or very reminiscent of Marshall's approach to social citizenship. So I think there has and already been a history of social democratic thinking in our country, and I think there's still, in the current context, a large range of scope for reinterrogating that thinking, to engage with it in terms of current frameworks for social change in South Africa. And I think it actually does offer South Africa a lot, the social democratic current of thinking, in terms of looking at social change models that essentially involve the state in meeting the social needs of the citizens, but in fact also develops a more inclusive model that involves social strata other than the working class, but in some ways also privileging the needs of working people as a core agenda of this state. So I definitely think that the social democratic agenda is an unexplored one that needs further interrogation, and that perhaps historical reflection on the work of, say, people like Kuma and African Claims could bring some of that to life again, that thinking to life.
Is one of the lessons of the 1940s and 50s, as evidenced in the African Claims and the Freedom Charter, that social citizenship rights should not be subordinate to economic policy? Is that some of the lessons that could be learned, perhaps, for the current South African society?
I would certainly argue that the historical lesson from a document like African Claims and the Freedom Charter is that, in fact, social policies reflect the social vision of the new kind of society, and that economic arrangements should underpin that social vision and those social policies, and it shouldn't have the reverse. I think, unfortunately, in the period, the neoliberal period went through with the gear proposals, we find that an inversion of that relationship where economic arrangements were privileged, and in fact social policy became a palliative to economic arrangements. And in fact many of those neoliberal economic proposals didn't in fact lead to forms of economic growth that met the social needs of a wider sector of a society, even despite the fact of massive government social expenditure in the social sector. So there's, I think, never a lack of commitment on the part of government to meet these social needs, but I think it was also a relationship that became inverted in a way that ultimately I think was not helpful in meeting the social vision of the new society. So certainly I think, yes, that relationship needs to be reinterrogated.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. That was very helpful. And that concludes the electronic lecture on social policy today. Thank you.
Thank you.